Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
Yeah, and we've got a really fascinating one today.
We absolutely do, because, what if the modern social safety net, like the hospitals, the homeless shelters, the welfare programs we all just sort of rely on today, what if that isn't entirely a triumph of modern secular government?
Right, what if it's something else entirely?
Exactly. What if it's actually, a stolen inheritance? Today, we are looking at a society that basically decided to keep this massive mansion of social service, but effectively, they just changed the locks on the people who originally built it.
It is such a provocative premise. I mean, we are looking at a massive structural shift in how society cares for its most vulnerable.
Yeah.
Moving from a system that was deeply driven by religious conviction,
Yeah.
To one managed by a purely secular bureaucracy, and analyzing exactly how that transition occurred, it really changes how we understand the whole concept of charity today.
It totally changes it, which is exactly what we are attempting to trace in today's deep dive. We're going to examine a really specific framework laid out by historian Frank Prochaska.
Yes, from his 2006 book.
Right, published by Oxford University Press. And the title is Christianity and Social Service in Modern Britain, The Disinherited Spirit. Now, for you listening right now, we have a very unique challenge and a really specific mission for this analysis today.
Yeah, this isn't our usual setup.
Not at all, because the source material we have in front of us is not the full standard text of Prochaska's book.
Far from it, actually. We are working with an archival fragment.
Just a tiny piece.
Right. It's a digitized record from the Internet Archive. And due to this temporarily unavailable restriction, the vast majority of the actual text is entirely inaccessible to us.
Completely locked away.
Exactly. So what we actually have is just the title page, the publication metadata, a short dedication to Bernard and Maxine Semmel, and critically, a single epigraph dating back to 1936.
And that is it. That is our entire window into this book.
Just a title and one quote.
So our mission today is to perform an intense micro-level analysis of this title and this single epigraph. We are going to extract the underlying mechanics of Prochaska's whole argument about the lost legacy of Christian social service in Britain.
We really need to understand the how and the why behind this core concept of a disinherited spirit.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to move from a title page to, a comprehensive understanding of societal shifts, we really have to start by analyzing the framework Prochaska gives us right on the cover.
Yeah, the title itself establishes the entire boundary of the argument.
Christianity and social service in modern Britain.
Right. It pairs these two concepts, Christianity and social service, that for the vast majority of Western history were virtually indistinguishable from one another.
They were the exact same thing. And the core information here really focuses on that intersection. For our listeners who are already deeply familiar with the work of city missions and the Salvation Army, I think it's understood that historically, you just didn't have widespread social service without Christianity.
No, you really didn't.
But I want to dig into the exact mechanics of that for a second.
Yeah.
Before the modern state stepped in, how did that integration actually function on a granular level in Britain?
Well, to understand the shift, you have to look at the foundational infrastructure of poor relief back then.
Okay.
For centuries, really dating all the way back to the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601, the safety net was fundamentally local.
Like neighborhood by neighborhood.
Exactly. It was inherently tied to the parish. The church was literally the administrative unit of social care. You had church wardens and local overseers who collected the poor rate and then distributed it.
So it was baked into the local church structure by law.
It was. But beyond just the legal requirement, the actual delivery of the care, the hospices, the orphanages, the physical feeding of the destitute, that was driven by a theological imperative.
Right.
The mechanism of charity was deeply rooted in the concept of agape, sacrificial Christian love. It was a highly relational system.
But the title specifically places this in modern Britain. And that word modern acts as a really hard dividing line.
It definitely signals a shift.
Right. It signals that we are analyzing the era where that historical synonymity just breaks down. We enter this new paradigm where social service and Christianity are no longer the same entity.
They become separated.
Yes. And that brings me to the subtitle, which is where I really want to push back and analyze the phrasing. Because the subtitle is The Disinherited Spirit.
It's a very deliberate, very weighty choice of words by Prochaska.
It is, but honestly, it also feels like kind of a mismatched metaphor if you take it literally.
How so?
Well, think about the analogy of a family will. In property law or just regular family dynamics, You disinherit a person.
Right, an individual.
Yeah. You cut a specific individual out of the will.
Yeah.
You deny them access to the family wealth, the estate, the titles. A person is removed from the lineage. But Prochaska isn't talking about disinheriting a person here. He suggests disinheriting a spirit.
Yeah, which is an abstract concept.
Exactly. My question is, how does a society practically execute the disinheritance of a spirit?
What's fascinating here is the legal and cultural weight of that exact word. Disinheritance is not a passive event.
It's an action.
Right. It is not some accident of history where society simply misplaced its faith or politely drifted away from religious practice. Disinheritance requires an active rewriting of the covenant.
Wow.
It is a legal and structural usurpation.
So, if we apply this family estate analogy to British social history, what exactly is the estate and who is rewriting the will?
The estate in this context is the massive, sprawling infrastructure of social good that was built by religious institutions over centuries.
So we're talking about tangible things.
Oh, absolutely.
Yep.
The physical assets and the operational methodologies. The schools, the vast network of urban missions, the addiction rehabilitation centers, the homeless shelters.
The ones established by groups like the Salvation Army.
Exactly. That is the accumulated wealth of the Victorian Christian effort. That's the estate.
Okay, so then who rewrites the will?
The modern state does. The state looks at this immense estate and realizes that for a modern nation to function efficiently, this infrastructure is absolutely vital.
Right. Because if you are building a modern, rationalized society, you need the trains to run on time, sure, but you also need poverty to be managed systematically.
You can't just cross your fingers and hope the local church raises enough money.
Exactly. You can't rely on the fluctuating budgets of local parish donation boxes.
Precisely. So the state decides to standardize, professionalize, and critically fund this estate through central taxation.
Which makes sense.
From a macroeconomic and administrative standpoint, taking control of the social safety net makes absolute sense.
But wait, where is the actual disinheritance then, if they're just funding it?
Here is a mechanism of disinheritance. In the process of absorbing that infrastructure into a secular government bureaucracy, the state slowly strips away the original motivation. The Christian spirit of charity, that deep belief that caring for the poor is an act of divine worship and a spiritual duty, that spirit is deemed irrelevant.
Or maybe even problematic.
Yes, unscientific, or even totally inappropriate for a modern government department to be involved with.
I see the logic of the state wanting control. But let me challenge the premise that this was some kind of hostile takeover.
Okay, go ahead.
Didn't the state just kind of have to step in? When you look at the sheer scale of poverty driven by the Industrial Revolution and then later the Great Depression, the volume of human need was just staggering.
It was unprecedented, yes.
Right, so private, faith-based charity, no matter how muscular or well-intentioned it was, it simply did not have the capital to manage national unemployment or systemic health crises.
It's entirely fair.
Wasn't state intervention just a macroeconomic necessity rather than a malicious usurpation?
You are hitting on the exact tension that drove this whole transition. Yes, the scale of industrial poverty completely overwhelmed the voluntary sector.
They just couldn't keep up.
The shift to state funding was largely driven by absolute necessity. However, Prochaska's argument, and his specific focus on the word disinherited, isn't necessarily condemning the state for providing funds.
Okay, what is he condemning?
It is critiquing how the state took over. The state didn't just provide capital to these existing missions, it demanded ideological conformity.
How did that conformity manifest practically? Like, how does a government department actually push the spirit out of a rescue mission?
It happens through the really boring mechanics of professionalization and licensing.
Bureaucracy.
Exactly. As the welfare state expanded, it began to require formal credentials for social workers. It established strict secular criteria for what constituted effective release.
But they changed the rule book.
Right. If a faith-based organization wanted to operate legally, or if it needs state grants just to survive in an era of very high taxation, it had to comply with secular methodologies.
Which means giving up some of their religious practices.
The state essentially came in and said, look, we will fund your shelter, but your staff must hold these specific secular degrees. You cannot require religious participation from the beneficiaries.
And the metrics changed too, I imagine.
Entirely. The reporting metrics had to focus solely on material outcomes, not spiritual ones. So many meals served, so many beds filled, but no reporting on spiritual care.
Wow. It's almost like, okay, think about open source software.
Okay, I'm with you.
The Victorian Christians essentially wrote the original code for social welfare. They did all the ground-level debugging in the slums.
They absolutely did.
Then the modern secular state took that open source code, slapped a proprietary government label on it, standardized it, and then gradually erased the original developers from the credits.
That is an incredibly accurate analogy.
They kept the software running perfectly, but they completely rewrote the core operating system.
That is exactly it. Society inherits the machinery of social service, the physical buildings, the shelters, the whole concept of a societal safety net, but it disinherits the spirit.
The spirit that possessed the energy to build it.
Right. The moral imagination to invent that machinery in the first place. It just leaves behind this functional but bureaucratic shell.
The action remains, but the reason for the action changes.
The underlying ethos transitions from a theology of grace to an administration of civic entitlement.
And for you listening right now, I really want you to apply this framework to the institutions in your own community.
Yeah, look around your city.
Think about the major hospitals in your area. Think about the established charitable foundations or those older homeless shelters downtown. Look at their founding charters, or honestly, even just look at their names.
A lot of clues in the names.
How many of them have a saint in the title? How many of them have a cornerstone on the building with a piece of scripture carved into it from, like, 1890?
A surprisingly high number once you start looking.
Now consider how those exact institutions operate today. They are likely doing highly effective, vital, life-saving work. But ask yourself, how many of them have entirely lost connection to the spirit of their founding?
The ghost in the machine has basically been evicted.
It has. It represents this profound mutation in our societal DNA. The shift from personal, morally driven charity to impersonal, state-administered welfare really alters how a society views its obligations to the vulnerable.
And Prochaska captures that entire historical and psychological evolution in just that one phrase, the disinherited spirit.
It's a brilliant framing. And that structural analysis perfectly sets the stage for the next layer of our deep dive.
Because Prochaska doesn't just stop at the title.
No, he doesn't just put that title on the cover and leave it hanging. In the very limited text we actually possess from this archival fragment, we see that he anchors his entire thesis with a specific, highly intentional epigraph.
Right. He opens the book with this quote.
He uses this kind of time capsule from 1936 to illustrate the exact moment this disinheritance was really being felt on the ground.
And the epigraph is a quote from the historian G.M. Young.
Taken from his work, Victorian England, Portrait of an Age.
Yeah.
Let's look at the first half of Young's quote here. He writes, quote, "In the daily clamor for leadership, for faith, for a new heart, or a new cause."
To really understand the weight of that observation, we have to establish the specific historical mechanics of 1936, because, this is not a random year.
No, 1936 is heavy. When I think of 1936, I immediately think of the absolute depths of the interwar period. The Great Depression has just hollowed out economies worldwide.
Utterly devastated them.
And the geopolitical situation in Europe is rapidly deteriorating. The old systems were visibly failing everyone. Is that the context for this clamor he's talking about?
Absolutely. You really have to look at the psychological state of Britain and Europe at that exact moment.
What was happening in Britain specifically?
Well, in Britain, 1936 is the year of the famous Jarrow Crusade.
Remind us what that was.
That's where hundreds of unemployed men marched all the way from the northeast of England down to London to protest the absolute devastation of their local industries.
Just grinding, unavoidable poverty.
Yes. You had systemic poverty that the existing systems, both the voluntary charities and the early governmental programs, were just completely failing to mitigate.
And internationally, it was even worse.
Internationally, the League of Nations was collapsing. It was proving entirely powerless. The Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936.
Which became a massive ideological proxy war.
Exactly, a proxy war for extreme ideologies. You had fascism consolidating extreme power in Germany and Italy, and over in the Soviet Union, Stalin was aggressively conducting his Great Purge.
So when Young uses the word clamor, it is not hyperbole.
No, not at all.
It wasn't some polite intellectual debate happening in a university hall over tea. It was a visceral societal panic.
It was a desperate shouting. The old Victorian certainties, the deep belief in continuous moral and technological progress, the stability of the empire, the foundational role of the church, all of that had been utterly shattered.
Shattered by the First World War.
By the trauma of the war and then the subsequent economic collapse, society was literally looking into a void.
And when human beings face a void, They clamor for something to fill it.
They always do. They were searching desperately for strong leadership to just impose some kind of order on the chaos.
Even if that leadership was terrifying.
Exactly. They were demanding new secular faiths, whether that was the extreme nationalism of the far right, the radical communism of the far left, or even just the promise of a purely scientific, technocratic state.
They needed a new cause because the old ones seemed to have completely failed them.
That's the atmosphere of 1936.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting for me, and honestly, why this deep dive feels so incredibly relevant to our listeners today.
Yeah, the parallels are strong.
They really are. Because while the specific geopolitical actors of 1936 were obviously unique to that era, the psychological condition Jung describes, that daily clamor for a new heart or a new cause, it feels incredibly contemporary.
It sounds like turning on the news today.
If you analyze the mechanics of the modern digital age, we are currently generating that exact same noise.
The parallels in the societal anxiety are very sharp.
Yes. The mechanisms of delivery have changed, obviously. I mean, we use social media algorithms instead of radio broadcasts and newspapers, but the underlying search is remarkably similar.
We are still clamoring.
It is an exhaustion of invention. You look at modern social discourse, and there is this constant frantic demand for new leadership models, new frameworks for social justice, a new heart for the culture.
We cycle through them so fast.
So fast.
Yeah.
We are constantly searching for the next ideological framework that will finally, eradicate inequality or provide ultimate meaning to our lives. We demand a new cause every single day.
We do.
But what is rarely discussed is the immense societal and psychological energy it takes to constantly invent new moral frameworks from scratch.
It's exhausting, and that exhaustion is a direct symptom of the disinherited state we were talking about earlier.
Tell me more about that.
Well, think back to your open source software analogy. If you delete the foundational code entirely, you have to write an entirely new operating system every single time you encounter a minor bug.
Because you have nothing to fall back on.
Right. When a society actively cuts itself off from its historical traditions and its theological roots, it essentially forces itself to improvise its morality and its social cohesion in real time.
Which is an impossible task.
It is essentially trying to build a cohesive, functioning society without a shared foundational text.
And because society is so exhausted by that constant daily search, it becomes completely blinded to the foundation it is already standing on.
We stop looking down.
We do. We are so obsessed with straining our necks forward to find the new cause that we completely ignore the massive historical infrastructure right beneath our feet.
And that blindness is exactly what G.M. Jung captures so brilliantly in the second half of his quote.
It is. It serves as a direct counter-melody to the panic of the 1930s. He contrasts all that modern noise with a profound historical silence. Let's bring in the rest of that epigraph.
Let's hear it.
Jung writes, quote, "I hear the ghost of late Victorian England whimpering on the grave thereof."
Whimpering on the grave thereof. It is such a striking image.
It really is.
Especially coming from an historian who is primarily analyzing social policy. It's very poetic.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of Christian social service, we really have to unpack what exactly constitutes that ghost.
Right. What is it that's whimpering?
Because modern society often holds a highly caricatured view of the late Victorian era.
Oh, definitely.
We tend to view it almost entirely through the lens of rigid class structures, deeply repressed morality, and this kind of superficial, patronizing charity.
The whole Oliver Twist stereotype.
Exactly. But that caricature exists, yes, but it entirely misses the reality of Victorian social action, particularly in the major urban centers.
It misses the sheer scale of it.
The late 19th century in Britain was a period of unprecedented, muscular, and highly organized Christian mobilization. It was the absolute golden age of the city mission.
It really was.
Let's give our listeners some concrete examples of that mobilization. What did this actually look like on the ground back then?
Well, it was anything but passive, I can tell you that.
It wasn't just sitting in pews.
Not at all. You had figures like Thomas Barnardo, who didn't just preach to impoverished children. He built an entire massive network of homes and ragged schools to physically pull them off the streets.
Systemic intervention.
Yes. You had George Williams founding the YMCA.
The Young Men's Christian Association.
Right, to provide safe, constructive environments for young men who were migrating to industrial London and getting lost in the slums.
And obviously we have to mention the Salvation Army.
Of course, William and Catherine Booth founding the Salvation Army. Their approach, particularly as it was outlined in William Booth's 1890 book, In Darkest England and The Way Out, it was a comprehensive system of social engineering.
It wasn't small scale.
No, they created labor bureaus, missing persons agencies, farm colonies, and widespread addiction rehabilitation centers.
They weren't just handing out a bowl of soup. They were attempting to construct an entire parallel economy of grace to counter the absolute brutality of the industrial slums.
That's a great way to put it.
Faith was not some private, internal belief system you kept to yourself. It was a loud, aggressive, highly visible engine of social reform. It had a massive physical footprint.
Exactly. The Victorian Christian response to poverty was highly interventionist. They believed, fundamentally, that social salvation and spiritual salvation were intrinsically linked. You couldn't have one without the other.
But by 1936, when G.M. Young is writing this quote, he looks back at that monumental, muscular legacy, and he describes it as a ghost.
It has been reduced to an apparition.
It lacks physical substance in the eyes of the modern state.
It's fading away.
And he doesn't just call it a ghost. He specifies that it is whimpering.
Yeah, that word choice is devastating.
It is. That word denotes a really specific kind of tragedy. It implies impotence. It is the sound of something that was once capable of mobilizing hundreds of thousands of people, something that was once capable of dictating the very terms of social care in the country.
A roaring lion, basically.
Right, and now it's reduced to a pathetic, ignored sound in the background of the modern political clamor.
The contrast between the muscular reality of the 1880s and the whimpering ghost of the 1930s perfectly illustrates the completion of the disinheritance.
The process was finished.
It was. The secular state, particularly as it began framing the really comprehensive welfare systems that would eventually culminate in the 1948 establishment of the National Health Service and the expanded national insurance.
The modern British welfare state.
Yes. They took the methodologies of the Victorians, the core concept of universal care, but they rendered the spiritual engine completely spectral.
But I want to focus on the final phrase of that quote.
Yeah.
The grave thereof.
Okay.
A grave implies a definitive end. Something is definitively dead and buried. And I think we really need to debate how it got in that grave in the first place.
How the ghost died.
Yeah. Did the Victorian spirit of social service die a natural death? Did the theology of the city mission simply, run out of steam, fail to adapt to modern macroeconomics, and just pass away peacefully, leaving this convenient vacuum for the state to fill?
Or was it pushed?
Right. Was it actively buried by a society that no longer wanted it around?
The historical evidence points heavily toward an active burial.
Really?
Yes, driven by distinct ideological shifts. The architects of the modern welfare state figures, like William Beveridge, for example, they were undoubtedly motivated by a genuine desire to eradicate poverty.
Sure, their motives for ending poverty were real.
But the underlying philosophy of the mid-20th century state was deeply utilitarian and increasingly aggressively secular. The prevailing attitude among social planners was that relying on religious charity was completely anachronistic.
It belonged in the past.
Right. It was viewed as patronizing, unscientific, and inherently unstable because it relied on voluntary giving.
So the state didn't just quietly fill a vacuum, it actively marginalized the voluntary sector.
Yes. The creation of a comprehensive, tax-funded welfare state fundamentally altered the civic landscape. It crowded out voluntary organizations.
Because if you're paying massive taxes for state welfare, you have less to give to the mission.
Exactly. When the state takes on the total responsibility for housing, healthcare, and unemployment, and taxes the populace accordingly, the space and the resources for independent, faith-based action shrink dramatically.
The state essentially paved over the vibrant, somewhat chaotic ecosystem of Victorian charity to build the sterile, standardized architecture of government bureaucracy.
It was an urban renewal project for the soul.
Wow. Which means the ghost is whimpering, not just because it is weak, but because it is trapped on the very spot where it was unjustly buried.
It is mourning the usurpation of its own legacy.
And for you listening, this dynamic directly impacts how you view modern activism right now. When you see contemporary movements championing housing equity, food security, or systemic reform, ask yourself, are these entirely new modern concepts?
Usually not.
Or are they simply built on the graves of past movements driven by deep, unapologetic religious conviction that modern culture has conveniently chosen to forget?
It's a selective memory.
Are we essentially just operating a rebranded, secularized version of the Salvation Army's 1890 social campaigns, while arrogantly pretending we just invented the very concept of caring for the vulnerable?
That is the uncomfortable truth embedded in Prochaska's premise. Modern society desperately desires the moral high ground that was established by the Victorians.
We want the results.
Exactly. We want the outcomes of Christian charity, compassion, equality, care for the destitute, but we absolutely reject the theology that demanded those outcomes in the first place.
We want the fruit, but we want to cut down the tree.
That's it, perfectly. And when we do that, we find ourselves with institutions that, while incredibly efficient and well-funded, often feel cold, highly bureaucratic, and completely devoid of a soul.
We are haunted by the very history we refuse to acknowledge.
Haunted by the ghost on the grave.
And the mechanism of that refusal, the way we literally block ourselves from our own history, that brings us to the final, really fascinating element of our analysis today.
Yeah, this part is almost surreal.
It is an element that wasn't actually created by Prochaska or G.M. Young, but rather by the literal digital reality of the archive we are using for this deep dive.
It is a remarkable coincidence, honestly, but it provides a perfect structural metaphor for the entire discussion we've been having.
We have to address the format of our source material again. As we established at the beginning, beyond the title page and this single 1936 quote, we cannot read Prochaska's book.
We physically cannot.
The digital record provided by the archive consists of hundreds of pages that just display a standardized automated error message.
Right. It literally reads, "Page temporarily unavailable. This page is part of a limited preview."
Just page after page of that. Now, obviously, this is just a technical restriction related to copyright law or digital lending limits on the archive.
Right. It's not a conspiracy.
No, I don't want to spend too much time overanalyzing a basic 404 error. However, we really should acknowledge how perfectly this technical glitch mirrors the cultural amnesia we've been discussing this whole time.
This raises an important question regarding how society interfaces with its past. Because the digital inaccessibility functions as a perfect microcosm of the cultural inaccessibility.
Exactly. The barrier here isn't that the history doesn't exist.
No, the book is real.
The book is sitting on a server somewhere. The historical reality of what the rescue missions achieved is an objective, verifiable fact. The history happened. But a wall, a barrier, has been placed between the modern seeker and the comprehensive text of that history.
The modern secular citizen is effectively living in a limited preview of their own cultural heritage.
Oh, that's good. A limited preview.
We are taught all about the development of the welfare state. We are told over and over that caring for the poor is a civic good. We get to see the title page of social service.
But the rest of the book is locked.
The underlying theological text, the massive, complex spiritual motivations of the people who actually built the foundations of that service, that is deemed temporarily unavailable by modern secular education.
It is treated as completely irrelevant data.
Just skip over it.
So what does this all mean for how we understand the evolution of social care today? We started this deep dive with a title that proposed a legal and structural disinheritance.
A massive shifting of the estate.
We examined the specific mechanics of how the modern state absorbed the hardware of charitable infrastructure while completely discarding its spiritual software.
Right.
And we looked at a 1936 quote that captured a society desperately clamoring for new political causes, yet entirely deaf to the whimpering ghost of its own Victorian legacy.
It means that the transition from faith-based charity to state-administered welfare was not merely an administrative upgrade.
It wasn't just better funding.
No. It was a profound philosophical shift. It moved society from a system based on personal grace and moral duty to a system based purely on civic entitlement and bureaucratic management.
And while the modern system provides, unprecedented scale.
Which is necessary.
Yes, necessary scale. But it still struggles with a deep void of meaning, a void that was created by that deliberate disinheritance.
The state changed the locks, but they found out they couldn't replicate the spirit of the original builders.
That perfectly sums it up. Now, as we start to wrap up this deep dive, it is crucial that we clearly define the boundaries of our analysis today.
Yes, very important.
The historical shifts we've discussed, this deep tension between religious institutions and secular government, the evolution of the modern welfare state, the psychological impact of broad secularization. These are incredibly complex and inherently touch on very deep political and theological debates.
Oh, absolutely. These are structural changes that provoke very strong opinions regarding the proper role of government versus the role of voluntary associations.
Definitely. People feel very strongly about this on all sides. But please know that our goal today has simply been to impartially trace the architecture of Frank Prochaska's argument and the historical context of G.M. Young's observations.
We are analyzing how they define this specific transition.
We are not taking a stance on whether the creation of the modern secular welfare state was a magnificent triumph of rational progress or a tragic usurpation of our spiritual heritage.
We are not endorsing any specific political framework for modern social policy.
Left or right. Our objective is simply to illuminate the ideas contained within the source material we had, providing you with the historical context to draw your own conclusions.
We're examining the mechanics of the transition, trying to understand how the past shaped the institutions of the present without dictating how the future should be managed.
Precisely. And to leave you with something to really consider as you go about your week, I want to bring this historical analysis directly into your current context.
Yeah, let's ground this in the present.
We spent a lot of time analyzing that 1936 daily clamor for a new cause, and we noted how loudly that clamor echoes in our modern digital landscape today.
It's deafening sometimes.
It is. When you look at your own community or when you are just scrolling through the endless online debates about how to fix society, you will inevitably feel that anxiety. You will feel that societal demand to invent a new heart, a new framework, a totally new movement from scratch.
The pressure to find the next big fix.
Yes. When you feel the pressure of that clamor, take a moment to pause.
Just stop and ask yourself, in our absolute desperation to engineer new solutions, are we actively ignoring the foundation right beneath our feet?
Or are we looking in the wrong direction?
If you quiet the noise of modern discourse just enough, you might realize that the profound, muscular compassion society is desperately searching for isn't actually something that needs to be invented.
It's already there.
You might just hear the ghost of a forgotten legacy. A spirit of radical, faith-driven service that literally built the very concept of social care, just waiting on the grave, hoping to be inherited once again.
The blueprint might already be written. We just have to be willing to actually read it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.